Welcome everybody to the 60 Skills review of Franz Bardon's book, The Practice of Magical Evocation. Now there is going to be some choice commentary during this review, which I'm sure is going to get me a lot of hate in the Bardon community, but we might as well go to hell and just get it all over with. So without further ado, let us begin. So, of course, the official title of the book is The Practice of Magical Evocation, a complete course of instruction in planetary spheric magic. The evocation of spirit beings from the planetary spheres of our solar system. Now, the original version of the book was published in 1956 in German. The second English translation by Dieter Rugeberg was in 2001, and this is a fourth printing from Mercurial Publishing in the 2014 edition. So, depending upon which edition you're working from, your results may or may not be a little bit different. So, the book is dedicated to his wife, Marie, and if you go to his gravesite, that is Franz Bardon's gravesite in Opava, you will notice that they are buried right next to each other. So this book would have been published in Germany for the first time, West Germany specifically at the time, 2 years approximately before Franz Bardon's death. Okay. So first we get to the contents page. And the first part just deals with what most people would associate with conventional ritual magic. It's important to keep in mind that Bardon himself did quite a bit of ritual magic from what we've been able to determine, although the exact schools involved are a little unclear. So it goes through the construction and uses of the magic circle, the wand, the robe, the belt, so on and so forth. Now, the part that gets interesting to most Bardon practitioners is where we start to get into the hierarchy of planets. So a couple interesting things about this. First of all, there are beings of the four elements. There are beings of the intelligences of the zone girdling the earth. And to be blunt, if you care to learn something, this is where you should probably put the majority of your attention. Because those 360 principles are schools that essentially involve every aspect of human endeavor. And because they are near Earth zone schools, the simple fact of the matter is what they have to say has a lot of applicability. Now, what's interesting about this is they are broken up in terms of their association with the zodiac. So you've got Aries, Taurus, Gemini, Cancer, so on and so forth. Next, you have the intelligences of the lunar sphere, which also are involved largely with the astral body. You've got the intelligence of the Mercurial sphere, which are largely involved with the mental body. And this is where the book starts to break down. Up until this point, everything that's there is complete. They give you complete descriptions of the various entities, what they do, so on and so forth. Starting with the Venusian sphere, you get the sigils and the name of the entity, along with a very brief description by category of what they do. Next, you get to the solar sphere, where once again they have a complete description of everything. Next, you get to the Martian sphere, or Mars sphere, in which he gives you only the written names and none of the sigils. Next, we get to the sphere of Jupiter, and this is where things get a little controversial, because research has shown that the Jupiterian spirits that are listed there are actually Saturnian and come from an outside source. Saturn sphere, again, left blank. Spheres of Uranus and Pluto are left blank, with the interesting lack of anything being said about Neptune. There's some interesting commentary on contact with beings of various kinds, some issues of magical talismans, and then we get into a brief description of the second tarot card. So the book, and this is what will start the Roll of Hate, is simply incomplete, as a lot of the things that you would want to know are not included. So, all right, we get into a brief introduction by Bardon, but let's be honest, the part that everybody's really interested in is the magic part. So we start with a brief introduction to the subject and its relationship to the second tarot card by Franz Bardon. Chapter 1 starts with a brief definition of magic, one of which is, since time immemorial, the highest knowledge has always been known as magic. And I suppose that works as well as any other definition. This goes on for quite a bit, talking about white and black magic, the different categories of magic, so on and so on and so on. He is interesting in that he does say that there are certain things that he will not get into, such as mamial magic, sympathetic magic, spell magic in cases of sickness, healing by sympathetic means, and so forth. So it's a good book in that it not only tells you what it's going to talk about, but it also talks about the things that it will not. Now, this is where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, in Bardon land, where we begin to discuss magical aids, all of the paraphernalia and empennage that magicians tend to end up accumulating. This is interesting because he starts when he says, although a true magician can achieve everything with his own power, which he has earned without any other help as a result of his spiritual maturity during his magical development, it is his choice to make extensive use of ceremonial magic and all the aids that belong to it. So he then goes on to describe all of the advantages in using aspects of ceremonial magic. Now, this is really interesting because most people talk about the necessity of these things. Bardon is one of the few practitioners I've seen that discusses the, let's call it, optionality of doing things. And this goes on for everything. It talks about the magic circle, of course, which is fundamental to a lot of practice to protect a practitioner. The use of the magical triangle in order to contain the entity being summoned. Magical sensor. Now, the magic mirror. This is interesting in that Bardon's use of the magic mirror is more in line with some things that you see in some of the old school European traditions, where this is being used not only as a containment device for the entity involved, but he breaks down several reasons why you might want to use it. And this is interesting because most descriptions of these kinds are not this clear. It talks about how to impregnate the room, how to essentially use the mirror as a telephone, so on and so on and so on. And if you check out the folks over at Czech Hermetics, there are people that currently manufacture these and in some cases even offer them for sale. I've known people who've bought and used a few of these devices, and they're actually quite useful. They take a little bit of setup, but well worth exploring. And this is certainly one of the better descriptions of the use of this technology that I've seen anywhere. Now, he also gets into the use of the magic lamp, which is very interesting to me because a lot of traditions kind of speed bump the use of this piece of technology. So this is one of the few descriptions where they really get into the different uses for it and how it can be employed in terms of the different colors or symbolically, or how to create a better environment for the entity that you wish to invoke, or evoke as the case may be. Of course, he has a description of the magic wand, and as per usual, this is considered one of the most important devices out there. Again, he has bullet points where he describes the uses for influence, for healing, for summoning of high intelligences, so on and so forth. And the descriptions in some cases are actually quite detailed. He describes how to charge things, the relationships with the elements, so on and so forth. Again, very useful information. Now he gets into the sword, dagger, or the trident, which again, these technologies sometimes get left out, but if you're going to be dealing with negative entities or entities that require a little bit of prodding, for lack of a better term, you really should have one of these. I personally have an iron axe that I hang on the wall next to me, but these have a little more utility when properly charged up. He talks now about the various clothing items, such as the crown, or a mitre, or a headband, the magician's robe, the belt. He also has a chapter on additional magic aids. The short answer of which is there are a lot of these that can be employed, and it's really up to a practitioner to determine if it's something that's worth their time. That being said, the more of you that's invested in the construction of the item, and typically the better it works. So again, the layman, and for people out there familiar with ceremonial magic, none of this is a huge surprise. He talks about the book of formulas, or in other words, your magical journal, basically. Talks about the different kinds of things that would be in there, such as sigils, notes on what happened, etc., etc. It's really a good read for those of you unfamiliar with journaling, by the way. Now he starts to get into a description of the spheres associated with the various entities and how they're broken down. This is, again, one of the more practical descriptions of this. And if you're not familiar with this, you should definitely take the time to read it. He also describes the relationship between the mental, astral, and physical world and the various planets. Different procedures involved, so on and so forth. Again, in terms of what's written and accessible, it's pretty enlightening work. Now he gets into the advantages and disadvantages of evocation magic and the different problems you can run into and the different approaches used. Everything from sorcery to necromancy, so on and so forth. And again, evocation magic isn't for everyone, particularly if you're talking about evoking into the physical. Use of things like magic mirrors or the crystal method can provide a little bit of a buffer between the entity and the individuals involved. And depending upon what you're doing, honestly, it might be a better way of doing things in general. Okay, he then talks about familiars or servant spirits, which again is another good description to get into if you're not really all that familiar with it. The main takeaway of which is if you form a relationship with something, well, let's just say there are credits and debits involved both ways. So finally, he gets into magical evocation. And again, different advantages and disadvantages of doing this kind of work. How to behave, suitable circumstances, so on and so forth. Again, more description of what goes on. Talks about some of the different things such as powdered herbs or incense that can be used depending upon the sphere involved. And this is complete, by the way, out through the Saturnian sphere. All right, now is getting to the part that most of us are watching this review for, which is a description of the various hierarchies of entities and the planets they are involved with. So he talks about this, and positive and negative beings, the seals, so on and so forth. All right, so he starts out with a description of the lords of the elements. Interestingly, a lot of people don't do much work with these. These elemental entities can be very interesting. They are essentially immoral in nature, or amoral in nature, I guess is a better way to put it. And the result of which is you have to watch your relationship with them very carefully. And to this end, Bardon talks about some of the tricks and traps involved in dealing with these different entities. In particular, he seemed to have a really hard time with air element entities. Again, I'm not entirely sure why, but there you have it. Okay, next we get to what I thought was probably one of the more interesting aspects of this work that generally gets left out, and that is the 360 principles of the zone girdling the Earth. Now, this is interesting for a bunch of reasons, not the least of which is if there's something that you want to learn, these are the entities, generally speaking, that would be teaching that to you. So, being on good terms with these and having access to them is probably in your best interest. And again, if you're looking to do something tangible, this is probably where you should spend most of your time. So again, whenever I want to learn something, this is usually the first stop. And what's curious here is the underlying meta theme throughout this entire book is actually Kabbalah. Now, nowhere is that directly stated, but what you will find is that despite the specific nature of entities associated with the planets, all of them have one thing in common. Every planet has Kabbalistic entities, or entities that teach Kabbalah. So this is something you should definitely keep in mind when you're going through this. Additionally, this book also, those 360 entities or schools, has a very interesting one named Hadsu, 26-degree Aries. Hadsu is a master of mental and astral magic. He teaches the magician to practically employ extraplanetary powers in the mental, astral, and physical world for various purposes. So even here, the extraplanar nature of things that need to be explored have an advocate. Very, very, very curious. So we go on, and again, all of these are broken down by the sign of the zodiac. I'm not going to read through these directly simply because there are 360 of them, and I'd like to keep the video on the shorter side. But suffice it to say, if there's anything you want to learn how to do in the physical world, these are pretty much the entities that will help you with that. So, okay, 10th sign of the zodiac. Okay, Aquarius, I think we're getting to the end here. 12th sign for Pisces. Okay, so he walks you through all of those, and again, anything you care to learn, they're there. Next, we start with the intelligences of the lunar sphere. Now, these are broken out in a somewhat traditional magic system in that it talks about the 28 principles of the lunar sphere. For those of you who are familiar with, of course, the mansions of the moon, there you go. So what is interesting is he does state spheric magic is not at all pure fantasy. Instead, it is a very secretive knowledge, and only the Kabbalist can be put on the same level. So notice that he does make a difference between spheric magic and Kabbalah. So again, we're in here, and by the way, Ezhobar is the lunar entity associated with Kabbalah, or at least one of the ones that are more commonly used. That happened to be the one that we use in my personal practice group. And of course, he talks about how the sigils have to be drawn in a certain color, and so on and so forth. And the relationship between the lunar entities and the astral body, which again is something that most people here should probably put a little bit of thought to. But I'm not here to talk about my own curricula. I'm here to review the book. And like I said, Ezhobar is the entity that we tend to use at the lunar level as our initiator of Kabbalah. And I want to find his description here right quick for everybody so we can just have a quick read of that. But, here we go, Ezhobar, figure 14. Ezhobar is the 14th principle of the moon sphere. Principle can benefit the magician. What it can reveal, the secret of how to easily develop himself the various occult and magical abilities with the aid of moon magic, so on and so forth. However, here's the important part. Objects in a very particular manner through Kabbalah. At the same time, the magician learns how to polarize and how to levitate himself and other human beings and objects in a very peculiar manner involving Kabbalah. Ezhobar is considered to be a fabulous initiator of Kabbalistic moon magic. And as we'll see, every single one of the planets has Kabbalistic spirits. Next we get to the 72 genii of the Mercurial zone. This is where things can get a little contentious because Bardon lifted these 72 spirits from another manual, although these are his personal sigils. The sigils for this do work, and if you are familiar with the works of our great Yugoslav friend Nanand, you can read up all about these different entities. So he talks about the relationship with the tarot cards and the four-letter symbol for YHWH, or Yod He Vav He, which is known as the Tetragrammaton, and its relationship to Kabbalah. Now this is where he has a brief breakdown of the different orders of the planets and their functions and what they generally do. What is curious is that Uranus and Neptune are mentioned on here, although interestingly, he does not get into describing any of the Neptunian or Uranian beings specifically in the book. So again, curious. This is where he makes the statement about Mercurian sphere is analogous to the mental sphere of human beings. Now, one of the big questions involved with this kind of practice is, do the planets generate mental and astral and vital energy, or is what they're generating simply similar enough that it can work as a substitute? I will leave that for you to determine on their own. So again, he gets into the 72 genii of the Mercurial sphere, and this is, entertaining, again, for all kinds of reasons, and I'm not going to get into each and every one of these because, again, we would be here all day long, but suffice to say, if you know the right resources, you can find descriptions of these as well. And once again, we get to figure 25, Nithaya. He is a Kabbalistic, or in this, Nithaya is the greatest arch-initiator of the Mercurian sphere as far as magic and the Kabbalah are concerned. Once again, a recurring theme regardless of the planet being utilized. Now, Mercury down is largely the realm of things that are directly applicable to the physical world. After Mercury, you really start getting into the sphere, pun intended, of things that, while applicable, tend to get a little more theoretical. Not always, but frequently this is the case. Or let's say dealing with the higher level order of things. All right, now he gets into the intelligences of the Venusian sphere. And he talks about the blissful states that can be generated, love, ecstasy, so on. However, this is where the book, to be honest with you, even though he details approximately 90 of these, really starts to break down. Because he'll give you the names of the entities and a general idea of what they do. For example, the eight intelligences of the Venusian sphere mentioned here have the same sphere of influence. They can be regarded as outstanding initiators of all erotic and sexual mysteries. Okay, fair enough. And he does give you the sigils for these entities at the back of the book. So that's good, but they lack the individual, let's say, descriptions that you see in a lot of the other planetary books. So that's a little, it's a little disappointing. Now, the entity that we use as our Kabbalah initiator in my course is number 77, Podme, very friendly. And he describes these eight as this group of eight intelligences teaches the cosmic language, i.e. Kabbalah, in its use in the Venusian sphere. The magician will also learn about reciprocal influences of the individual spheres on Venus and its sphere. Besides that, magicians will be instructed as to how he can practically apply his knowledge in magic and the Kabbalah. So again, it's the consistent theme between all the planets. So he gets in here and talks about, not remaining constantly in contact with an intelligence, so on and so forth. Next, we get into the genii of the solar sphere. Okay, and there are 45 of these. And Imnisut, of course, very useful for any kinds of thing, any number of things, so on and so on and so on. And, of course, I have to give a shout out to Levum when we get to him, because Levum is the 42nd genius of the sphere of the sun. He is the original creator of all magical knowledge and the Kabbalah. So, again, unifying theme. Now we get on to, the intelligence of the Martian sphere. Again, Bardon only gives us the names and there's zodiacal associations. He doesn't actually give us the sigils. If you're familiar with the magic square type work, you could probably come up with something that works. I came up through path working with a few Mars spirits that work pretty well as well. Okay, this is another controversial part where he talks with the genii of the sphere of Jupiter. He gives you 12 of these. He describes what they do. Unfortunately, the sigils for all of these are for, Saturnian spirits. You'll see that because there will be drawings of Saturn in some of the sigils. Also, it's very curious in that nowhere in these descriptions of the entities does he talk about wealth or rulership or health or any of the normal Jupiterian type functions. He talks about karmic principles. Very curious. And so on and so on and so on. So as far as that's concerned, it's interesting. Now, he does get into a description of the Saturn sphere itself, but again, provides you nothing. He talks about the spheres of Uranus and Pluto, which is interesting because Uranus, the entities there, speak Kabbalistically. So if you want to study Kabbalah, a lot of reasons to do that. Uranus also has a relationship to the mental sphere, Pluto to the vital sphere, and Neptune to the astral sphere. But he curiously leaves out any real discussion of Neptune in the book itself. So he talks about mental wandering through other places and how it's, not necessarily helpful or applicable. That's sort of true in a roundabout way. It can be rather dangerous. But again, this is a review of his book and not a review of my personal coursework. Gets into some more descriptions about, the zone guarding the Earth, destiny, the physical body, moon sphere, astral body, mercurial zone in the mental body, so on and so forth. The colors to be utilized with the different planets. And again, interesting, Uranian sphere, lilac. Very curious. Pluto, light gray, and by the way, both of those appear to be correct, but no mention of Neptune. Now, this is a chapter that doesn't get used much by people. It's magic talismanology, which I highly advise if you're into talisman work looking into, because this allows you to do this on your own. I'm not going to go through it in much detail because, quite simply, that's not really what we're doing here. But suffice to say, if you're working on talismans or alchemy of any kind, if you know how to do Kabbalistic letter work, and you can apply that technology to the power of the planets directly, your stuff is going to work really, really, really well. And again, another shout out to the 462 methodology mentioned in the third book. So here we have a brief epilogue. Gets into symbolism of the tarot card, and then probably the most important part of the book, he gives you all of the sigils for various entities of one kind or another. So again, I'm going to end the review there, but from what I can tell, Bardon was basically really involved with the work of the second book. And I think the work of the first book and the third book were things that he dealt with, but really wasn't a specialist in. This work, the practice of magical evocation, was clearly what he spent most of his time working on, and it shows, even if the book itself is remarkably incomplete in some odd ways. So, if you like the topic of today's discussion, hit a like button down below and consider subscribing to the channel. Otherwise, as per usual, train hard and be well.